Well, good evening. If everybody could please take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started with this event. I want to thank everybody for coming. Particularly, I want to thank the Daniels College of Business here at the University of Denver, and particularly Professor Hall, who seems to have brought a lot of his students, and the director of our program, Dr. Sharon Lassar, for her help. I also want to thank the Sturm College of Law and Stacy Bowers, the Corporate Commercial Law Program, who is helping to sponsor this event, as well as the Graduate Tax Program and Isaac Ladico, who is assisting in this event as well. So we are really excited tonight to have you here, and to our online guests. We are very happy to welcome you as well. And we would like for you, if you have questions during the evening, we have our communications director, Judy Willard, monitoring the feed, and we'll take your questions and we'll present it to our guests. And so with that, I want to introduce the guests for tonight's event. Again, this is about the release of the financial state of the union for 2023. This is the state that our federal government is in. And that's what our speakers will be discussing, as well as some of the future legislation that is being put into place right now to help bring more transparency to government reporting. So our first guest, let me make sure I stay within the speaker range, is Sheila Weinberg. Sheila is the founder of Truth in Accounting, and she actually received her bachelor's degree right here with her degree in accounting. She serves on numerous boards and provides commentary on the federal budget. She is the individual who created the Truth in Accounting project, where we produce reports not only on the federal government, but on the state of our states and the state of our cities. We also produce a transparency report that lets taxpayers, legislators, and other individuals know how transparent the reporting is of their state governments. She has spoken on Social Security, Medicare, and other national issues, and she has been published in numerous publications in USA Today, Chicago Tribune, Chicago Sun-Times. She's been a guest on local and national television, podcasts, and radio shows. Sitting next to Sheila is Marc Joffee. Marc is a federalism and state policy analyst at the Cato Institute. He has had op-eds that appears in the Wall Street Journal, the Orange County Register, the Fiscal Times, Governing, National Review, The Hill, and the San Jose Mercury News. And our third guest is joining us online. We're very lucky to have Professor Jacob Soll. He's a professor of history and accounting at the University of Southern California, and he wrote the book, The Reckoning, Financial Accountability and the Rise and Fall of Nations, which is a really excellent book. And it is possible that if you're an accounting student, your professors may have used some of his material in their class lectures. I certainly have. This book presents a sweeping history of accounting and politics to review how accounting can be used to build both kingdoms, empires, and entire civilizations, but also can be used to undermine those very entities. So welcome to our guests. Welcome to you attending. And so thank you. I'm going to go ahead and now turn it to our guests to give some opening remarks. And we will go ahead and start with Sheila Weinberg. Sheila, if you want to open this up.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. Now, Tuesday, I don't know if you guys know, was tax day. But what we're worried about is that citizens really don't have the information they need to know how much governments are spending, how much debt they have, how much taxes are going to have to be paid in the future to cover all the debt that the governments have already accumulated. People in Washington are currently touting that they reduced the deficit in half. And now it's only $1.4 trillion. But if you look at their audited financial statements, they show that that reports that the deficit was $4.2 trillion. And we do our annual financial state of the union. And if you include the increases in unfunded Social Security and Medicare liabilities, the deficit was actually $12.2 trillion. Now, I know those numbers sound huge, they're big, people's eyes glaze over them. But today, Jacob Soll will explain why you should care about those numbers and you need to care about those numbers. And he'll also explain the ways that the lack of proper accounting for the federal government's books and financial mismanagement has in the past led to financial ruin for other societies, and how we will continue to have these financial crises, the housing market crisis, and then the COVID crisis. Will continue to have financial crises if the books are not cleaned up. Now, I believe that the financial state of the union, and that's why we produce it, is a very important part of the State of the Union. But President Biden, like all his predecessors, really did not discuss the financial state of the union during the State of the Union address. One of the reasons that he didn't is because they didn't even issue the state's 2022 financial statements until a week after the State of the Union address. At Truth in Accounting, as Chris mentions, we spend a lot of time researching doing research for our financial state of the states, our financial state of the cities. Keep in mind that tax day was not just at the federal level, it was also tax day for a lot of state and local governments. And what we find, just like how the federal government does not issue its financial statement on time, we find that many state and local governments do not issue their financial statements in time for critical financial decisions. For example, a lot of them are issued after their budgets are prepared and voted on. So they don't even know how well or bad they did the prior year before they vote on the budget. Mark loves to point out the poster child of bad late financial reporting, but California did just issue their 6/30 financial statement. Oh, but that was 6/30 for June 30 of 2021. So can you imagine a corporation issuing their financial report 631 days after their fiscal year end? I don't think they would get away with it. So we spend at Truth in Accounting, we spend months digging through the financial statements of state and local governments to produce our reports. We dig through their what they call annual comprehensive report, plus their pension plan reports. These reports are like 300 pages long, and they're all done in PDF formats. Now, I think that we're in an era of big data, and we do have computers, and even AI is being discussed at this time. So in this day and age, we really think that taxpayers and citizens, even elected officials, should have the financial information of their government at their fingertips. So after Professor Soll speaks, Professor Soll is going to speak about the mismanagement of finances. Mark is going to discuss the lack of transparency that state and local governments have, and efforts that he has led and others that are working to bring greater transparency. At this point in time, if you don't mind, Chris, I'll turn it over to Professor Soll.
That's great. Professor Soll, we're excited to hear your perspective of what has brought us to this chaos that we're experiencing that Sheila has so accurately described.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. And I appreciate it. And I appreciate what you do. I do want to say that not everyone agrees about all these numbers, but one of the reasons is, as I'm about to explain, is that the federal government and other governments, they do not keep proper account books, not even close to it. So, for example, we could argue over Social Security, but there are other things we really can't argue over because the numbers are completely speculative. And I just want to I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And it is quite scary in many ways. And it's infuriating because to keep these books would cost money. But as we see now, we have all these tools, we have all these computerized tools, we're getting AI tools. And the fact, this is something I'm going to come back to again, the Department of Defense does not use double entry bookkeeping. That means that it just does not know what its finances are. And it's not even clear that their finances are integrated within the Department of Defense. We're talking a budget of around 700 billion plus, plus, plus. We could talk about other examples too, but that's a sort of famous one. It's scary. It's not historically unprecedented. But what I did want to tell you guys, I wrote this book in 2014, and I went into some of the bigger governments in history, and I found that when governments were being founded, successful governments did have an eye on accounting and state building. So the states, when literally people were building states like the United States or like the modern state in France or the reform state in Britain, these are big, powerful states, right? States that have defined modernity. Accounting was front and center in state building and in criticism about how to build a successful modern state, which is why we have almost every major constitution has an accounting clause that not only shall accounts be kept, but they should be presented at a sort of regular basis. What I found was that if you go into state archives, when you see accounting going badly and you see poor accounting standards and you see the lack of a real central ledger, that means, a ledger, an account book with sort of internal reporting coming through to a center control point, it means that there's trouble and trouble ahead. And it also means that the word accountability actually comes from French, accountabilité. It just means accounting. And it actually has, the word accountability comes, I believe, I've looked at this from the French Constitution of 1793, a revolutionary constitution, where the actual English and the Americans looked over at this constitution and said, look, we want to think about this too. So what I found is actually, in history, there aren't so many hard and fast rules. But one of the things I found is that if you have a government with very poor accounting standards, and let's just say we can argue about debt, but my God, we can't argue about managing debt badly. I mean, who on earth thinks that's a good idea, right? It's usually a bad sign. So if you literally go back and you dig, you can actually see states not doing well and coming into crisis by the quality of their accounting. Not to mention their debt, that's another question. Lots of states do well with lots of debt. States don't do well when they manage it badly. And that's kind of where we are now in the United States. We have massive entities that do not use the basic accounting that you need to understand value. And this isn't, you can run certain businesses with cash accounting. The German federal government actually produces its financial statement with cash accounting, which just means cash accounting is completely fudgeable or fungible. You can completely fake it. So I would say that the German federal budget or its deficit, the whole thing is completely made up. With double entry accounting, there is an internal checks and balances system, which means there is accuracy. If you have good internal reporting to a central ledger, then you can have a sense of what's going on. So we don't have that. We're not even at the point where we can really seriously talk about the numbers. That alone, to me, that in itself is really scary. And I will say one more thing, and I think this is what Marc is going to mention. It's really hard to trust your government at that point. And that's why there seems to be this kind of fatigue. There seems to be this cynicism. There seems to be an idea about funny money, because the fact is that whether you believe that debt can be manageable or not, if it's not transparently accounted for and discussed, it becomes something quite terrifying. And historically, there's a precedent for that too. So I think that's sort of where we are. And I think that I've been working on this for almost 10 years as a kind of like, I've gone to, actually I helped the Greek communist government get good internal reporting. I've worked all over the world on accounting standards. I've seen small progresses, but I've also seen, as we get, I think, closer to more financial crises, less transparency than I'd like and less use. That Britain has one of the best central ledgers in the world. They just do not use it. It's just like, I know the people that made it. So I'm like, these guys actually have better accounting. They don't even use it. So we're at a point where it's not part of our lexicon. By the way, honestly, when we talk about this, I would assume that the lecture hall would be filled with every student. This is like your life. This is your future. And the fact is that we're out here making this case, and it's not, as Sheila noted, it's not like centrally part of political discourse for anybody in politics, right? Except for a few cranks like us. And we're not anywhere near each other on the political spectrum, which also shows you there's not a sort of unified movement on this. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say that this is really important, that there's a historical precedent for this. And for me, the problem is actually this sort of profound lack of literacy, interest, and standards in accounting. And it's something we need to think about. And I think when we talk about it, it becomes something we can all agree on. But we've got to get the message out there, and we need to discuss it. Thank you.
And Chris, you were going to mention 1492.
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you, Jacob. You brought up good points and a good segue to Mark, and specifically as it comes to transparency. But I want to make a point. I was speaking to a group earlier today, and I say this often. If you think about it, and you've learned about this, that in 1492, 1494, what happened in 1492, students? You know this from grade school. 1492. Yeah, exactly. Well, also around that time, who's the father of accounting? Somebody knows who the father of accounting is. I don't know. Pacioli. Does that name ring a bell? Luca Pacioli. He wrote the treatise on the basically accounting, some of the first printed documents that was included in his book, the Summa. And the Summa was one of the first widely distributed books. And it was part of, he talked about arithmetic and proportionality and geometry. And it was printed on what printing press was the first printing press?
No.
The Gutenberg.
No, it wasn't printed on the Gutenberg. No.
Well, it was the first book printed though, right? I mean, it was one of not the first book, but the first book. Don't correct me right now, Jacob. It's my story. You can tell me, you can correct me later. Anyways, this is what I read in somebody else's book. But so anyways, Pacioli, some of the first printed documents about accounting, some of the first, we won't quantify it, was in Pacioli 1492. How is government accounting reported today? On what type of a document? A PDF, printed documents. It's not machine readable. And so the point is that much of the way that governments report accounting today is much the same way it was reported in the 1400s. Would you agree with that, Jacob? Okay, good. I got something right. So that's going to transition. The point is that government accounting, the federal government, the state governments, the local governments, they report much the same way it was done hundreds of years ago. So that is my segue to Mr. Marc Joffee to go ahead and talk about his work and where government reporting should be going.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Christine. So I'm very interested in the finances of state and local governments. Question for you. Can anyone guess how many local governments there are in the United States? Don't be shy.
I'll say 15,000.
90,000. So the problem is that because all of their budgets and financial reports are in PDF form, no one really knows the total finances of those 90,000 governments. No one knows the total tax revenue that they've taken in. Nobody knows the total expenditures. Nobody knows the total debt. You can estimate, and the census does that. The Census Bureau, uses statistical techniques. They look at the larger governments and they look at a sample of the smaller governments, and they come up with an estimate of these various values. But it takes them over 2 years to produce that estimate. So the last census data that we have right now is from 2020. And as you know, we're in 2023 right now, having gotten onto the other side of COVID. So the system that we have in the United States for collecting financial information is not fit for the 21st century. It's not fit for purpose. So what can we do? Well, starting in 2009, the Securities and Exchange Commission asked all publicly listed companies to use a format called extensible business reporting language, which is a machine readable technology for reporting financial information. By machine readable, I mean that a computer with a simple program can ingest this documentation and then do ratio analysis on it, total it all up, do any kind of numeric manipulation you'd want. And ipso facto, we would get to knowing a lot of the kinds of things like what is the total debt of US state and local governments. So that was done for companies in 2009. Now, as early as 2002, academics were proposing that this be done for state and local governments, but it was only in 2018 that the first law was passed to require XBRL reporting, and that was in the state of Florida. Now, since then, we've also seen movement in the state of Michigan, and then last year, Congress passed the Financial Data Transparency Act, or FDTA, that will eventually require governments that issue municipal bonds, which is about 30,000 of these 90,000 governments, to file statements using that format. And we're hoping that that will begin to be implemented in 2027. So maybe by the end of this decade, we'll finally be in the 21st century as far as financial reporting for state and local government is concerned. I think I'll leave it.
Okay, great. Are there any questions yet for our panelists? All right, so Judy, do you have a question that's come online?
We hear a lot about Social Security and Medicare, but are there other federal programs that are fiscally unsustainable?
Let's start with Mark's, and then we'll go to Sheila and then Jacob. We'll see, kind of go reverse order here.
So a program that I look at a lot is Medicaid. Medicaid is a program that provides healthcare services for people in various categories, including people with low income, older individuals who require nursing home care and no longer have the assets to afford it, and some other categories. So that program has been growing very rapidly, much faster than the rate of inflation and similar to the rate at which Medicare is growing, and it's just received a lot less attention. A big thing happened just at the beginning of this month that may help us rein in the costs of Medicaid. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Congress passed a law that said the federal government is going to take a bigger share of Medicaid spending. So Medicaid is a joint state and federal program. So the federal government is going to take 6% higher share than it's taken previously. And in exchange for that, states will not review eligibility. So anyone who was in Medicaid at the beginning of COVID stays on Medicaid. And so what happened is we gained over 20 million Medicaid beneficiaries, and now we have over 90 million people on either Medicaid or a similar program called the Children's Health Insurance Program. So just think about that. 1/4 of people in the United States are on this. So now with the end of the pandemic health emergency and effective April 1st, states can start once again making eligibility determinations. And I know a lot of people who monitor this issue are really concerned. Are we going to kick needy people off of Medicaid? Well, some people who are in the Medicaid rolls from 2020 are dead. And yet we may be paying providers who may be somewhat unscrupulous, money to cover those people. And as we sort of described earlier, we don't have that kind of money. We're, what is it, Sheila, $140 trillion in the hole?
Yep.
So, we got to be a little bit more careful with our pennies, right? So I think that's a very positive development, and it's really going to depend on, how aggressively states implement this to, shrink the rolls back down to their pre-COVID levels.
Sheila, do you have something to add?
I just add, in the audited financial statements of the US government, they do during their management discussion and analysis, and also during the auditor's opinion when he writes a letter, which is done by the Government Accountability Office, they do mention this unsustainable word. It's like the federal government and its programs are currently unsustainable. And I always just was like, well, what exactly does that mean? And they really don't explain. It's like, what does unsustainable mean? So I think that, if people really understood that, exactly what that meant, they might be more cautious. But you know, it's just unsustainable. That means it can't go on. The other fascinating thing, which I think the accounting students will find, is that the federal audit, if you get a chance, read the federal audit's financial report, especially their audit opinion, which is a disclaimer opinion. The auditors say that they can't audit 49% of the assets of the federal government, and a quarter of the expenses cannot be audited. So it's, you know, they just don't know, you know, what's going on. And then I just wanted to comment on Jacob's comment about cash basis accounting. So these governments, you know, they do have accounting standards that do require them to use accrual accounting at a consolidated basis. But one thing that it's already been pointed out is the elected officials never look at these statements. They're just financial statements are produced. They produced after the budgets are done, and they're not looked at. And I find, so all these governments, including the federal government, are doing their budgets on a cash basis. It's interesting because the IRS does not allow a corporation that makes more than, I think it's $5 million to do their books on a cash basis, but yet that's how all these governments are doing their budgets. And the reason you don't do them on a cash basis, as you know, is because it's, you know, unreliable and can be misleading. Jacob.
Sorry about that. I'm not totally in accord with all the numbers and all the conclusions about various programs, but I'm completely in accord about the insanity of not measuring them in I don't know, an accurate way, right? By the way, I mean, I've done a lot of work with IFAC and trying to help governments to train accountants and hire them. Governments try, and as you say, politicians don't necessarily, and I'm not knocking all politicians, I'm really not, I'm not in that game either. Politicians don't often pay attention to it, because I will say this, I've worked in this, is that the public isn't asking for the accounts. When the financial crisis in 2008 happened, I was researching this book. I actually was sitting there as the crash happened, and I was studying financial crises in the 18th century in Britain. And basically in Britain, when they had financial crises, there were these arguments in Parliament. You know, the financial press was invented in the 1720s when people just started publishing balance sheets about government debt, about companies, which hadn't actually done accurate reporting or accounting either. So that, I think, is another issue, is that politicians in democracies respond to what the public asks of them. And the public isn't asking enough of this. They're just not getting it from their voters. And this is a huge, 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 huge problem. If you went to, you know, your local voter meeting and everyone raised their hand and said, look, I want to see a real balance sheet, and you had a lot of politicians getting that response, maybe we would see it. So yeah, this is a really problematic situation. As far as unsustainability, we could, you know, there are things that are unsustainable, others that historically aren't. Britain went for a long time with 249% of its budget in debt, came back. It's not advisable, but you know, these things can be done, but they can't be done if you don't manage well. And I think that's one of the biggest messages. So let's just say you're sitting in this room, and you're like, well, I'm all for Medicaid. And let's say you're sitting in this room, and you're like, I'm not for Medicaid. Either way, you're going to have to agree that if we're measuring this wrong, it is kind of a train wreck, right? There's just no way that can be good. It's dangerous. And the fact is, people's lives depend on this. So if we mismanage it, we're going to have really bad outcomes. That's my sense. And so, and the fact is then it allows people, for example, who think Medicaid is bad to say, look, why should we have this thing at all if it's so badly managed? And that is, you know, that's a legitimate point, isn't it? So I think that, you know, I mean, the statistics also, I do want to say, you're absolutely right. By the way, in 1340s, 1345, the Republic of Genoa was using really high-end double entry books for parts of its national ledger. I mean, people could actually look at that, by the way, and most educated people were able to actually understand those books. So in many ways, we're actually behind where we were in the late Middle Ages, just for the record. Like, it's even worse, right? So, you know, I mean, in a funny way, this is that weird democratic thing where it gets back to you, right? It gets back to the citizen. And unless you understand this, and unless you ask these questions, it is not my sense that we're going to deal with this unless we deal with it in a crisis, and we don't always deal with that well, right? I mean, 2008, look, TARP might have been necessary, but to hand out that much money without receipts. By the way, I wanted to tell you guys this story really quickly. I know the accountant for the Iraq War. She was a USC grad in accounting. She was taken on, and she just said they were throwing bales of millions of dollars out of helicopters. And she said billions were just literally just thrown out. She had a clip pad, okay? And she just was supposed to account for it. She said it was impossible. So the Iraq War, literally, the accounting was just throwing cash out of windows. Just telling you guys that. By the way, that is not how you win a war. If you're going in to win a war, you want to go in with good accounts. That's another historical thing that I've found. Well accounted for militaries often do better, although you get a lot of dead in war. I mean, we're at this point where that's going on. By the way, do you even know that? Don't you think that's a fact you want to know? Laura Robinson, good friend of mine, who's also an accounting activist, she was on those choppers going, I can't account for this. I'm a trained forensic accountant. I can't do it. By the way, don't you think that would be like a great front page story? You're not going to hear it. I mean, it's just completely crazy to me. Where
What
are
about the crisis we just finished where, COVID, and it appeared to me that the federal government just turned on a fire hose of money to try to drown things. How do you think that, was that accounting done? I don't think they had enough systems there to account for it all properly. And what we find is that a few governments, state governments, got disclaimer opinions because they threw money at their unemployment funds, and their unemployment systems could not manage those properly. They were sending out checks to whoever, prisoners, dead people.
I think
they
it's also.
didn't have the systems.
I think it's also important to note, to Sheila's point, that when we did our financial state of the states and financial state of the cities for that time period, because of the influx of cash, because of the stock market rises, it made everybody look like they were fiscally more solvent. They had more money. Everything went great. And what's going to happen on our next report, because of the crash of, or certainly the downturns of the stock market and the stoppage of all of these funds, that suddenly all these entities are not going to look so fiscally sound. And because they look fiscally sound, I think here in Colorado, everybody got, or taxpayers got a check, right? Because there was more than enough money. But was there more than enough money if it was all a temporary situation? And so that was happening as well. Mark, do you have any kind of an input to that?
Well, one thing Jacob mentioned that interests me is the fact that Britain in the post-war era was able to survive 250% debt to GDP ratio. And, we are seeing that type of thing in Japan as well. The issue really is one of interest rates. So if interest rates are very low, your debt service costs on that very large volume of debt is affordable. And that was really where we were until just about a year ago. So now in the US, I think our debt affordability has gone down quite a bit because of the fact that these high interest rates that the Treasury has to pay right now are causing the interest on the debt to increase, and that will eventually crowd out other kinds of expenditures. So I think these kinds of issues are very sensitive to market conditions, especially interest rates. And I guess one other thing I'd ask you, Jacob, is I like what you said about the Iraq War. I mean, I guess maybe I shouldn't say I like it. I think it was very insightful. How do you feel about what's going on with Ukraine right now? I noticed that Congress wouldn't even agree with an amendment that Senator Paul put forward to have some level of auditing and accounting on the aid being sent to Ukraine. Shouldn't we at least be demanding that?
I mean, in all these situations, yes. Again, I mean, I'm not sure that Paul cares about that. To be honest, once again, I'm not totally convinced about that. But yeah, every single thing like this can and should be accounted for, right? I mean, that's just a legitimate thing. they are just not accounted for over and over and over again. So it's, again, I'm going to say here, perhaps rather than questioning, this is not the forum to question the actual policy, but to actually question the execution of not just that policy, but like policy after policy after policy, right? I can take it right back to the American military where there's this, the accounting is disastrous, right? And where's Paul on that? Maybe in a good place, maybe not. I think that one of the things that's really important in this is to make it clear that whatever your policy opinions are, this affects you. That whatever you think is right or wrong, as far as what a government does, I really would actually argue. Some people will say, look, there's an emergency, we can't totally account. By the way, every major country in the world did COVID funding, and it was possibly necessary. The amount of fraud was insane. That was unnecessary, right? So that's the one thing I think we can really agree on. And I even think from a sort of moral philosophy standpoint, we really cannot argue that it's good to have poor management, right? Over and over again. So no one can argue with us against that, I really think, and yet we're not getting movement on that. And that I find to be crazy. And that's one of the reasons I really warn against highly partisan uses of this, because it's so hard to move this kind of stuff forward. The question that I sort of want to throw back at you guys is, how do we get better accounting? And how do we get that across the finish line, right? Or across the touchdown line? How do we do it? There's got to be some sense of bipartisan support for something like this, because there's so much self-interest around not reporting well in government, right? I mean, that's why you don't see any changes. That's why you see constant pork barreling, right? By the way, pork barreling, really bad pork barreling, it does extremely well with bad accounting. Take the state of Iowa. I could go into that one.
Jacob, you just said a couple that are really a great segue. Judy has a couple questions, but I'm keep your question, because I want to segue to what you said with basically the transparency and the management, and that goes to, we'll bring up the Financial Data Transparency Act and what we're hoping that brings. So keep that. But I do want to say one quick thing, because I've got about 3 things going on. But what I want to make a point that this panel is very diverse. We purposefully brought together a group of people who are, they call themselves libertarians, Democrats, independents, Republicans. And the point is, for you students, so seldom do you see a group of very diverse opinions getting together and talking about their opinions in a really collaborative way. We haven't agreed on everything. We've seen heads shaking like this and heads shaking like this, but we're all still friends and respect each other. So I do want to say that that's really important. We don't always have to agree. We do have to listen. And so with that said, I'm going to go first to Marc to talk about transparency and the Financial Data Transparency Act. And when that's done, I'm going to go ahead and have Judy ask the question, and then we'll ask Sheila to answer it first. So Marc, if you want to take that.
So, just to reiterate what I said earlier, the whole idea is that we have all these governments, they're filing documents, essentially, that are not machine readable, and the FDTA will make them machine readable. But even then, there are other things that we need to achieve. So while I agree with Sheila that many governments ignore their accrual basis audited financial statements, at least they have them. But in certain states, like for example, New Jersey or Arkansas, accrual accounting isn't even required. So nobody could, even if someone on the city council or the school board wanted to look at an accrual-based picture of what's going on in a city or school district in New Jersey, they can't do it. So I think one reform that I'd like to see on top of the FDTA is a universal requirement that all state and local governments use accrual accounting. And then a second problem that Sheila alluded to is a lot of issues with late filing. So you heard California filed 1 year and 3 months later than they should have. Puerto Rico, an entity that actually went into a state of bankruptcy, at one point fell 3 or 4 years behind in terms of their financial reporting. So I think, the federal government, which receives these financial reports as part of the auditing process for grants, should really put its foot down and say, look, if you want to continue receiving and expending grant funds from federal taxpayers, you have to file on a timely basis. It has to be accrual accounting, and it's got to be a clean opinion. And I mean, that's a little bit hard for the federal government to say because it doesn't have a clean opinion. But I think we have to draw the line somewhere and expect these three components before we continue to provide additional assistance to state and local governments, just to make sure that they're spending it properly.
Yeah, and
Sheila, I'm sorry, but
Go
Judy's
ahead.
been really excited to ask a question and you will answer answer that question.
Well, this one goes to the Financial Data Transparency Act and Joe wants to know, are there other provisions of the act that we should know about? How is it,
It's very limited in the sense that it only talks about the format of the way the data is presented. It does not require that governments provide any new data. It doesn't, for example, do what I just advocated, which is require accrual accounting. So it's just one step. In terms of what else it does, it actually affects any kind of financial reporting that goes to, I think it's 7 different federal agencies. So there's a lot of other things like asset-backed securities reporting to the Federal Reserve that will be affected by this. But for my purposes, I'm mostly interested in the state and local piece, and it's very narrow.
Sheila, you want to take that and anything else that you were thinking?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that the financial statement is not used is because it's not paid attention to during the budget process. And the budget process is the largest financial decision that the governments make. And because the budget is done on a cash basis, it doesn't really, it doesn't tie to the accrual portion of the financial statements. Another reason I don't believe they're used is because the accounting standards, you guys know about FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. Well, the state and local governments do not use FASB standards. They've created their own board. And under that board, the board requires, it doesn't suggest, it requires the state and local governments to keep 2 sets of books. So they keep a cash basis set of books and they keep an accrual set of books. And if a government, like if we come in and we say, hold it, you have a balanced budget requirement, which 50 of the states do and 75 of the most populated cities do. Most governments require their budgets to be balanced. If we go to them and say, well, your budget isn't balanced, they will point to the cash basis budget and go financial statements and go, yes, they are. And in that statement, they can loan proceeds because it's cash in. Loan proceeds are in essence recorded as revenues. Then your expenses, all the expenses aren't included. So for example, in Illinois, the loan proceeds, the governor of Illinois, he stated that for the last 3 years, he has balanced the budget. Well, during COVID, Illinois, all the governments were running out of money. They went to the bond markets and all the governments got money from the bond markets, except for Illinois and a couple other municipal funds. Their credit was so bad that they couldn't get a good interest rates. So the Federal Reserve opened up a special borrowing facility, in essence, printed money and gave it to Illinois as a loan, $3.5 billion loans. Well, the governor, because they do the budget on a cash basis, he balanced the budget by using that $3.5 billion to balance the budget. And then also in Illinois, and this happens in most governments, you might hear that the governments have pension problems. Well, again, the way they calculate the budget in these financial statements, it's only the cash that you pay out. So even though the employees are part of their compensation, they're earning salary, they're earning healthcare benefits, they're also earning the right to receive these pension and retiree healthcare benefits. The government incurs a liability for that, and they incur an expense for that. Well, the only amount that shows up on the budget is whatever the government wants to contribute into the pension plan. So the pension plan just if to balance their budgets, they will just not. And then Illinois is famous for, if they get a bill from the printer, and they can't balance their budget, then they just wait and don't pay it. They've had years where they're like, they had to pass a law in Illinois. It got so bad that the vendors weren't getting paid that they passed a bill that the vendors get 1% a month interest on the backlog of the bills. And then,
They did that with Medicaid.
yeah,
They were 3 or 4 year delay in payment, and there was even a secondary market where you could factor your receivable, and so you get 97% on the dollar, while the factor would.
yeah. And surprisingly, some of the former legislators were part of the factoring business. Oh, just,
Can I point one other thing out that's really important that I just want to add into what you're saying, and this is coming from a diehard Democrat. One party states, this is what happens. And you see states where you don't get political turnover between different parties. This is why democracy is so important, you guys. And this is why it's so important not to have gerrymandering, so that you get that kind of dynamism that we've had historically in America, where you go back and forth between parties and people end up having to take responsibility and clean up messes and answer to their voters. And I think you've just made this point. One of the things in Illinois is it not just bad management, it's actually the fact that we have many states in America that are stuck with one party. That does not always inspire good financial management.
well, and one reason that they're stuck with one party is because they don't truly balance their budget. And the reason you have, balanced budgets is not just a mathematical game, it's an accountability game. Yeah, the politicians shouldn't have the pleasure of spending, i.e. they're going to get a vote, without the pain of taxing. And you need to keep that in check. But by doing bad accounting, you can actually spend more money than they're actually taxing. And so Illinois, one party state, and other states have become very good at going ahead and providing more government than the taxpayers are paying for. So hold it, I'm getting a good deal. I'm gonna continue to elect these people.
So on that note, Judy has another question, but I think Sheila brought up that the federal government had a disclaimer opinion. A number of state audit reports also had qualified or disclaimer opinions. So it is a fact that they're red and they're blue states. There isn't one color that's really doing it great and another color that isn't doing it great. It can be across the board, and it can be attributed to the fact that potentially they are one party states, but
South Carolina, right?
yes,
South Carolina overstated its cash position by $3.5 billion, and that's, I think, a one-party state in the other direction.
yeah,
So
exactly. So again, I really want to bring this home to the online listeners. We hear a lot about being of one political party or not, and we need to stop that thinking, because this affects us regardless of what party we are. Accountability, management, the things that our speakers are talking about, we have to talk about this in a reasonable, measured way and listen to each other to help resolve. These are big problems. Judy,
I'm going to put Sharon and Sharon or Tom on the spot, and just if you could highlight what would happen to a corporation if it got a disclaimer audit opinion.
Would be to delisted, most likely.
Delisted from the stock exchange and wind up in bankruptcy. But the federal government has never gotten a clean opinion. They've always gotten a disclaimer opinion. And these state governments got disclaimer opinions. But nobody seems to care.
students, do you have do any students have a question before we go to our online audience? Judy, what question do we have?
Well, you guys are segueing really well, because the question is, how did we get here? Is it greed? Is the bad accounting because of greed, or is it just bad accounting?
Let's start with our historian, and then we'll work our way back around the group. So Jacob, what do you think?
I mean, there's a history to this, right? And one of the things we did get at a certain time is we got various accountability offices in the government. We have had, I mean, one thing I will say is this is because I've been working on this for a long time, trying to figure this out, right? We've had we really have a drop in accounting literacy. I mean, my great grandmother, who's German, I mean, she's 103. She's not keeping account books now, but she kept them until quite recently. My father, who comes out of the Great Depression, has a little piece of paper in his wallet. He accounts for everything. When I started this out, what blew me away is my generation had no clue about accounting and of course disdained it. So one of the things I studied, and actually I believe Arthur Anderson played a role in this, is that accounting, by the way, we're having an accounting shortage and accounting schools are having a shortage of students. We're actually in an accounting crisis. It's really bad. So we have illiteracy, we don't have enough accountants. That's not the way it used to be. Accounting lost its social sheen. It's not like finance. It doesn't have the, it's not like banking or even consulting, whatever that means, right? It doesn't have the cachet. And, you know, one of the things when I was writing the book, not all of it went in there, all the jokes about accountants, you know, from Ghostbusters onwards, accountants are denigrated. And, you know, sometimes they are being counters and pencil pushers. You know, and that sometimes that's a bad thing, but most of the time with accountants, you really do want them around. So what we've had is a cultural sort of depression of accounting as we do it less, as it becomes less of a political necessity, as it leaves our lexicon. So I really think that this is a bigger thing. It's really hard to get at this, but as I've in the accounting schools this year, I've been seeing, you know, leaders of accounting schools saying, my God, we're really having a hard time attracting not only students, but top students. And it is of grave concern. One last thing, when I started this book, 2014, the Financial Times, which is the most read financial newspaper, one of the top 3, it had these brilliant accounting journalists who were writing all this stuff about malfeasance actually in the private sector. They're gone now. I went to Bloomberg in 2014 and talked to the journalists at Bloomberg, and they said, yeah, we've got some accounting historians, and I met our accounting journalists. We're going to get more accounting journalists. They never did. So, I mean, this is like a major thing right here that no one wants to talk about, is that we're in like a big accounting cultural desert. And I'm curious how many students in this room would prefer to go into accounting or banking. By the way, accounting's harder. Sorry, that's one of the problems. You got to really know stuff to do it. Sorry.
So Mark, since you're, you know, talking about financial journalists, Mark does a lot of writing. So let's go to Mark, and then Sheila as the Truth in Accounting founder and puts out reports. So let's hear from it. And then we're going to go into closing statements. So I just want to give you that heads up.
Well, the accounting scandals continue, right? We had Wirecard in Germany in I think 2019, and now we've had FTX. So you know, being able to keep track of things and audit them is very important in the corporate world, just as it is with governments. In terms of the question about how can we make things better, one point I like to focus on is process reform. So in the federal government, we do have a bipartisan situation that's completely out of control. So it's not only one party states, but I think when you have access to the printing press, it doesn't matter whether you've got one party or two parties. It's pretty easy to lose discipline. And part of that has been that a budget process that was developed after World War I has totally broken down. So it used to be that, by the end of the federal fiscal year, September 30th, I think there were 12 different departments that all had to have their budgets signed off by both houses of Congress and then signed by the president. That has not happened, for 20 years or something like that. So that's a big problem, and we don't have a predictable process. And we can think about how we can inject accounting into that. Like, for example, saying the president's budget shouldn't be produced until the audited financial statements from the previous year are presented and reviewed. Congress should have both of those. Maybe we need to go to a biennial process. It'll take us 2 years to get all this done, but we're not getting it done by any kinds of deadlines. And I think we really should be holding our leaders more accountable to a process and to meeting deadlines for doing things. And that it's not really a big government point or a small government point. If I'm a small government person, but if the majority in Congress would like a more active government that taxes more and spends more, so be it. At least let's have a proper process, have it debated with accurate financial inputs.
Thank you, Sheila.
Well, I would just urge the accountants listening and especially since we're in front of accounting students to start paying attention to your governments. I think governments previously were of the size that you really didn't need to pay attention to them. They were a very small part of your lives, but now they've become very large parts of your lives, between, taxes, spending, regulation. And I think it would be good for students and accountants to go into their local governments, look at their audited financial statements. There's a lot of very interesting data in there, and they do produce balance sheets, but again, the governments don't pay attention to the accrual balance sheets because they're, for some reason, can only understand this inflows and outflows of cash. But accounting students and accountants could go in and help them understand that, oh yeah, you may be balancing your budget on a cash basis, but you're incurring all of this debt. So I urge accountants and accounting students to just get involved. Again, it's not a policy thing. It's just educating them about what these financial statements are and what they're saying, and that they could be helpful in decision making.
Great. Thank you. We are in the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to go to Jacob first, then Mark, and then Sheila to give your last 1 to 2 minute closing thoughts on this discussion. So Jacob.
Yeah, I think a lot has been said. By the way, we used to have big government too, and we used to have like 70% tax rates. But this is the whole thing that Mark said. How on earth can you make the case for more taxation, necessary or not, right? If it's not being managed well. And by the way, I'm really glad to hear there are young accountants in the room. I want to actually just address you in my closing statement to say, look, you actually, by the way, take humanities classes, learn to speak in public, learn history, learn culture, and learn to lead. Because if you do, you can actually do much, much more than other people. I tried to get my daughters to learn accounting. They didn't want to, they couldn't. And I said, look, you're artsy kids, but if you could account well, think of what you could achieve. I know that from history, that message didn't get through to them, but think what you can achieve if you think about accounting in a kind of grand and ambitious way as a form, not just of management, which is important, but also of leadership. And I think that kind of sums up what I've discovered in my research. And I think it sums up a lot of what we're sort of asking for here. We're calling for some kind of leadership on this. And your generation, it was with many things, you're going to actually have to take the lead on this. And that's going to mean thinking about accounting in new ways. Also, as AI comes in, you're going to have to think creatively, culturally, and with great ambition.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I also want to hit that generational point as well. So I know most young people these days are really concerned about climate change. What is the long-term sustainability of our planet as we add more and more greenhouse gas emissions? But there's another type of sustainability that I think people really don't focus on, which is financial sustainability. So this report from Truth in Accounting says that the federal government is $146 trillion in the hole. That is something like 6 to 7 times the size of our gross domestic product. I'm a boomer. Okay, boomer. I probably will not be paying the price for this. My generation has enough political power to extract the Social Security and Medicare benefits that have been promised to us. And ultimately, you're going to be holding the bag. So I think the sooner young people learn about these facts and understand more about accounting and advocate for more fiscal sustainability. And again, it doesn't necessarily imply low tax and small government. It can be the other way. But make sure that you're holding Congress and the president and your state governments, accountable to balance their books in accrual accounting terms.
Sheila.
Thank you. Well, I use California as a bad example, like we always do, and Illinois, and other states, again, during this COVID crisis and after they got the federal money and after they borrowed money, a lot of state governments said that they had a surplus. So for example, and there was all of this discussion on how are we going to spend this surplus? And there was additional, there were checks sent out, there were tax cuts done, there was additional spending. But if you did the accounting right, these governments were hugely in debt. Illinois was more than $140 billion in debt when they said they had a surplus. California was more than $200 billion when they had a surplus. And it's just the bad accounting. But again, it's not just a numbers game. We really believe that our representative forms of government are in jeopardy because citizens do not have the information they need to make tax and spending policies or even who to vote for. So that is why your accountants, it's not a sexy topic to some people, but I really believe that, if we don't get this right, we're going to destroy our representative form of government.
All right, well, thank you to our panelists, to Jacob Soll, to Marc Joffee, and Sheila Weinberg. Thank you to all of you for joining us. If you want to hear more about this or learn more about our reports are for free at truthandaccounting.org. You can certainly visit that website. You can reach out to any of us. Our emails are on there, and contact us if you have specific questions, whether you're in the audience in person or via the internet. We are very, very thankful you joined us tonight, and I would really like to reiterate, this is not a red or blue problem. This is not a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent problem. This is a human problem. And we need to, as humans, to discuss these issues and find ways to resolve these problems. Thank you so much for joining us.